February 11th, 1986. My 35th birthday. I'd been through what for me was an excruciating divorce, deep depression, remarriage to a wonderful woman, new life, rejected as a pastor by many, many people. The church I planted and which had grown large wanted nothing to do with me. But I had a new life. I was a counselor, had colleagues, was making a decent living. We had a little place in the country where Rachel could have a horse to ride, where Joshua could raise sheep to show in 4-H, where Elliot could sit up in a big tree and listen to heavy metal music. 35th birthday. Got a call at work. You got to come home right away. Feeling of deep dread over me as I drove that 30-minute drive to home. As I came down the dirt road, I could see the emergency lights flashing, fire engine, ambulance, police cars, sheriff, deputy cars in front of the house and in the road right directly in front of the house, as well as in the driveway. When I got there, a young man with a very kind look and a very sad look opened the door for me. I got out, he said, "Your wife is in the ambulance." The back of the ambulance was open. Kathy was seated on the gurney with a volunteer fireman who also was a friend of ours seated next to her. I think he had one arm around her shoulder, and with the other hand he was holding an oxygen mask over her mouth and nose. She was as white as a sheet. He lifted the oxygen mask off. She looked at me and with a trembling voice said, "It's Elliot. He's dead." And I said, "What? What happened?" And the volunteer fireman, his name was Gene, said he left a note. And this feeling of incredulousness washed over me. Suicide? Elliot? This kid with straight A's, this kid with more potential than any 20 normal people put together? This kid who's on the wrestling team, this kid who has a steady girlfriend, a suicide? This kid who has never shown any symptoms of depression? I was in shock. I remember saying, "What about the younger children?" And they said, someone said that they're at the neighbor's house. The Connerys lived up on the hill. They also were good friends. The school bus had taken them there. So Rachel and Joshua were there at their house up on the hill. I said, we need to go to them right away. And one of the younger volunteer firemen said, I'll drive you up there." Kathy and I clung to each other, and the very first thing I remember saying was, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away." And she repeated with me, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." Not that I believe that God in any way caused that suicide, but that was the first of many scriptures that would sustain us through that night. We spent the night at the Conry's house, and Kathy and I sat up in the bed all night long with our arms around each other, and scripture after scripture that we didn't even know that we knew came out of our mouths, back and forth. I would share something, she would share another, and back and forth all night long. We got up to the Conry's house. The young man looked with deep sadness, and he said, "I kind of know how you feel. We lost our little one 2 years ago." I remember saying I was sorry for his loss, and went into the house, and Kathy and Rachel and Joshua and I held each other in a tight circle. We told them what had happened. All of us were crying. All of us were sobbing. I remember Rachel saying, "Why? Why?" And I remember saying, "I don't know, honey." That same precious Rachel who, when she found out her mother and I were getting divorced, cried and said, "Why is this happening to our family?" And back then I said, "I don't know." Lloyd Conry, after all the emergency people had left, went down and cleaned up the house. Nobody does that for you. He scrubbed the rugs and the baseboard. Elliot had dressed up like he was going someplace. Leather jacket, cap, scarf. He had let his outdoor cat come in to the house, which was unusual. He had written a note that said, among other things, it was a very brief note, but it said, "I'm not depressed. I just want to try a new life." He asked that we give his class ring to his girlfriend. He told us in the note that he loved us. After writing that note and placing his class ring on top of it, he had, we later learned, sat down on the sofa, pressed a .22 rifle to his forehead between his eyes, a rifle that we kept to chase the coyotes away from the sheep and the goats, and he had pulled the trigger. He was, according to the coroner, instantly dead. The coroner found no evidence of any drugs or alcohol or substances of any kind. No abnormalities. Our lives were plunged into hell. All of us. Elliot's mom, Becky, Rachel, Joshua, Kathy, myself, Betty's parents, my parents, our siblings. Our lives were plunged into hell. I don't know why I spent so many years being afraid of hell. I can't imagine it could be any worse than that. I became radically clinically depressed. Part of what kept me from committing suicide was my intellect. My default position was to learn as much as I could about teenage suicide, how to prevent it, causes, recovery, grief, all that. I read book after book after book. I wrote articles for the local newspaper. I wrote essays, but I was so deeply depressed. And then those panic attacks that I had when I was a child, those panic attacks that went away when I was a junior in high school and had that glorious spiritual experience during which peace flooded over me. I had not had any panic attacks since then. They came back with a vengeance. The first one struck me as I was walking down the street on a lunch hour or something. I had no idea what was happening. I went to doctors. I thought I was dying of a heart condition. Eventually, we figured out what it was. And I went the route of self-hypnosis and meditation and prayer in order to pull myself through those panic attacks. And those exercises helped a great deal. Through it all, Kathy was there to cry with me, to hold me, to support me. I would not have survived without her. I'm so grateful for her. And through it all, she was such a good mother, stepmother, to Rachel and Joshua, encouraging their relationship with their mother, loving them unconditionally, teaching them how to bake bread and do farm girl type stuff, taking them to 4-H projects, and she was just a rock, though she was grieving too. We were all grieving in our own ways, but all grieving. And there was a colleague that I had, a member of a First Nation, an indigenous Native American, brilliant counselor. After Elliot's death, she came to me and presented me with the gift of 2 bronze deer. And she said, in our tradition, rather than send flowers or such, we give a gift. And it touched my heart, and it meant so much to me. And to this day, every time I see a deer, I am reminded of Elliot and of life. It has been a process of many, many years. You never get over the death of a child. The sudden, unexpected death of a child is even harder, I think, to deal with. And an unexpected suicide, I can't imagine anything worse that a parent could go through. Years and years of depression, of trying therapy, getting a little ways, moving on from that, self-help, prayer, writing. Eventually, folks in Colorado Springs invited me to start yet another church, and we did. Um, it didn't grow to be a huge mega church while we were there. It actually did after we left, under the leadership of others, but it was a nice little church. Rental space, a couple hundred people, good friends. And it was during that time that I got a call from Chuck Smith asking me if I would consider coming to California and taking over being director of Calvary Chapel's Bible College, which was located in the San Bernardino Mountains near the Lake Arrowhead Resort. And I agreed, and that started the next chapter of our lives. But one more thing of significance happened before we left Colorado, and that is January of 1990. So we're about 4 years after Elliot's death. Oh, and by the way, my parents were strongly supportive, especially my dad, after Elliot died. He didn't know what to say. He never did. But he was a presence. He was there with me. He went with me to the funeral home, and he paid for the whole funeral, and he didn't interfere at all, but he supported me in picking out the casket. I mean, he sat right next to me and stood right next to me the whole time. He went back after they had prepared the body, and it's just he and I, and gazing at Elliot's body, and him, closest he ever came to sharing feelings. He got choked up, and he said, "I thought I knew him." See, Elliot was very close to my parents. He spent some extended time with them in Annapolis, and my parents got him involved in sailing lessons in Annapolis, and they had a canoe, and they would take him on through these back creeks and stuff. So my dad was a strong support. Well, 4 years later, January of 1990, I got a call, and it was that same happy-go-lucky sing-song voice that I remember from an infant, when my mother said, even though I was screaming, choking on my own mucus, said, "You're fine, you don't need anything," and left the room. It was that same voice later when she said, "Oh, well, everybody has to die," and left. That voice. She called and said, "Hi, Larry, it's Mom. Your dad died this morning." And I remember saying, "What? You're kidding." And she went, "No, I'm not kidding." And then she continued to talk. I don't know what she said. I wasn't listening. And I remember I kept trying to interrupt, and I finally did interrupt. And I said, I've got to go. I'll talk to you later. And we hung up, and I turned to Kathy, sobbing and saying, "My dad died." Suddenly, unexpectedly, in his case of a heart attack. And I remember crying out and saying to Kathy, "I can't go through this again." And once again, she held me and cried with me and said, "I know. We'll get through it together. We'll get through it together." And there's a lesson in that for all of us. We'll get through this, whatever this is. We'll get through it together. I'll pick up the story next time.